Hey, it's Amy Shaw, the Soul Whisperer here. I'm a practicing shaman in Austin, Texas area, and I'm also the founding editor of The Urban Shaman. I am making a second video today. In the last video, I talked about shamanic journeying and the difference between that and actual shamanic practice or shamanism. Today I want to talk about a similar thing, and this is the misperception that I encounter a lot, that shamanism is a religion. I think it's so important to make this distinction because in my understanding, okay, I'll cap it at that. It's my understanding. Maybe people have a different understanding. I've been a student at the Foundation for Shamanic Studies for quite a while now. I'm entering year 3 of their 3-year program. I come from that sort of background, from that understanding, from that influence and that paradigm of what shamanism is and how to define shamanism. That being said, I've also been a student as well as a teacher's assistant at the School of Modern Soul Science, which takes a much more archetypal definition of shamanism and is in a lot of ways anti-archaic shamanism, anti-stereotype shamanism. So I balance both of those experiences. My experience at the Foundation, which is, a very traditional, archaic expression of shamanism, and then the School of Modern Soul Science, which is a much more modern archetypal interpretation of shamanism. And I'm able to really walk both those paths and balance that well. Sometimes it is a little bit tricky, but for the most part, I think that I do a fairly good job at balancing that. So that's sort of where I come from in terms of the paradigm of my understanding of shamanism. And, certainly people are going to have their own interpretation and their own definitions of what shamanism is. I'm always curious to talk to those people. Mostly what I like to know is where they got their definition from, how they developed it, or where it came from. Because, I made a video a while back talking about who can call themselves a shaman, and it's kind of a little bit of a rant in a moment where I was experiencing some frustration with that, because that is also an ongoing conversation that's constantly coming across in my field about who can call themselves a shaman and who can't. And along with that comes this very inherent need to first define what shamanism even is. And so in that process of defining what shamanism is, I find that a lot of people are very confused about it, and they equate shamanism with a religion. To me, in my path, in my training, and where I come from, which I've laid out for you and made that very clear, shamanism is not a religion at all. It's an actual practice. It's a practice. To me, calling shamanism a religion is like calling yoga a religion, or meditation a religion, or, martial arts a religion. All of these things have underpinnings that have spiritual and religious roots to them, so they can all be traced back. Of course, yoga is from certain tradition. The martial arts, come from, varying, but basically certain traditions. Meditations, we can have those in many different cultural expressions, but they all are bound on some fundamental level to a spiritual tradition and a cosmology of some sort. They're like the technical, practical arm of the spiritual paradigm or the religion of a certain culture or region. So that being said, I really see shamanism fundamentally as that. It's not a religion, it is an actual technical practice. And so because it is that, it has a very specific parameter of what it is and what it isn't. Obviously, when we go into a yoga studio, we expect to see people, doing yoga. If we're calling it yoga and people are doing Tai Chi, then that's not yoga, is it? Or if they're doing Taekwondo, or they're doing Aikido, that's not yoga, right? Or if we're calling it meditation, but people are doing yoga, that's not exactly the same thing. I mean, there may be overlaps in all of these things on some fundamental level, but technically speaking, the skills, the technique, the discipline, the practice is going to be very, very unique for each modality. And so fundamentally, shamanism is the same way in the sense that there's a very specific technique, very specific practice, a certain discipline to it, a certain, way of being. You don't just call yourself a shaman because you have a certain belief system or you have a certain idea that how shamanism relates to spirituality. In the same way that I wouldn't call myself a yogi because I don't practice yoga, so I'm not a yogi. In the same way, I wouldn't call myself a black belt or a yellow belt or any kind of belt because I'm not actually practicing any specific lineage or technique of martial art. And so shamanism is the same way to me in essence, in those is the same to me in those same kind of ways. Now, as I said, just as all these other modalities and practices have underpinnings of certain religious ideas, shamanism does as well. So if it's going to be tied to any specific religion or tradition, that would be animism. Now, animism is different than shamanism, but it overlaps significantly. And again, a lot of people confuse these things. I've made videos about this before, and I've written articles about it before as well, that there's fundamental differences between animism and shamanism. In indigenous cultures, the whole entire tribe, the whole entire community was animistic. So they all came from that same idea, perspective, belief system. But that didn't make them all inherently shamanic. So there would be, specific roles within the community of people that were the shamans existing within the animistic community. And so in that sense, shamanism has always been tied and will always be tied to animism. It can't really separate itself out from that, the best that I can tell, in any kind of way, because the fundamental aspect of shamanism is working with spirits. If you don't believe in spirits, then how are you going to do any kind of work with spirits? This is where I think, getting into like the school of modern soul science and this idea of archetypal shamanism, it gets a little hairy, it gets a little tricky, because the archetypes tend to be based on Jungian, Carl Jung, the famous psychiatrist, who was the protege of Sigmund Freud, who deviated significantly from Freudian thought and theory. But Carl Jung, is the one who really brought us this concept of archetypes. And in actual clinical practice, tried and true Jungians, I'm talking about PhD Jungian analysts, they tend to be extremely atheistic. Although we can equate the archetypes technically with spirits or with essences in a shamanic sort of animistic worldview, Jungians actually do not. They do not believe in spirits. They believe everything. They're solipsists. So in other words, they believe that everything is a projection from one's own mind. So in other words, if I did shamanic journeying and I had, direct encounter with a spirit, a true Jungian analyst would not believe that was an actual direct encounter with a spirit, but it was a projection from my own psyche, or a drawing down from the quote-unquote collective unconscious. And so they call the spirit world the collective unconscious. And so in this way, this is how Jungianism and shamanism differ. It's where they diverge. And I'm not talking about Jung himself as a person, as an individual. That's a different conversation for a different day. But in terms of, modern clinical Jungian analysis, it's very atheistic, very solipsistic, and it's, in essence, anti-shamanistic, because they don't really believe in the spirit world, and they don't perceive spiritual experiences as existing externally, but more as internal projections of the psyche. So this is how archetypal shamanism differs from archaic shamanism. But archaic shamanism is completely tied to animism. So going back to that, animism in a brief nutshell definition is the belief or the idea that everything has spirit, that everything that exists in our material realm is an animate object projected from the spirit realm. So even man-made objects possess or have the ability to possess a spirit. And so what shamans do is go across that veil into the spirit realm to access the spiritual layer of this 3D world that we're in. there's that occult saying, as above, so below. In essence, that is the foundation of shamanism, in the sense that shamans believe that everything that's occurring in our 3D material reality is a reflection or a projection, actually not from within our own selves or our own psyche, but from the actual spiritual realm, that spiritual layer, that middle world layer, where the spirits are able to break through that veil and interact with us, where they can affect our material reality in very profound ways, both for the good and the bad. So in other words, they can cause disease and malady and trauma and everything else, both directly and through human beings, puppeteering human beings in a sense, unconscious human beings, that allow that to happen. They can attach themselves to human beings and cause sufferings and addictions and that type of thing. But they can also cause miracles and all kinds of benevolent blessings and other things to us. Certainly synchronicities and these type of things can be part of the language and influence of spirits. And so this is what shamanism is. And going back to the idea of animistic cultures and shamans existing with animistic cultures, and this is what makes it a challenge to be a shaman in a westernized culture that's not animistic. We're very materialistic. We're very rational, scientific minded. In animistic cultures, everybody believed in spirits. So when people were out in the jungle hunting together, and they saw things or they heard things or they had certain experiences, direct experiences, maybe the whole group of hunters fell ill, or maybe they came across a jaguar while they were out in the jungle, or maybe there was some other, type of anomalous experience that really caught their attention. Everybody in that group understood that this was a spiritual thing, that something was happening and the spirits were trying to communicate. But what they didn't all understand is what the spirits were trying to communicate or why. And that's where the shaman would come in. So when somebody went to see a shaman, they fundamentally understood that my sickness is a spiritual disease and I need shamanic assistance in determining the spiritual cause of it, the spirit that's meddling in my life and causing this, and why, and how do I remedy it. And so that would be the role of the shaman, is sort of like the interpreter of culture, the interpreter of the spirit realm, the interpreter of events that were happening, the oracle that could, foresee events and help stave them off or invite them in, that type of thing, the mediator between the material realm and the spirit realm. So it was fundamentally different, or it is fundamentally different in indigenous cultures that are animistic, to see a shaman and have that expression of shamanism, that role. It wasn't as anomalous or as confusing or as convoluted as it is in our rational materialist culture. In this culture, we want to fit, the round peg into the square hole, or the square peg into the round hole, in the sense of, making shamanism be our own thing apart from animism. In actuality, we really can't, in my opinion, do that. Although people are trying to do that work, and they're approaching it from this sort of archetypal view, and they're, feeling out the different facets and elements of shamanism that exist outside of a culture. But the more we do that, the more we're getting away from the fundamental aspects of shamanism, which is animism. It just, in my mind, shamanism cannot be separated from animism. It just can't. But by the same token, as I've said a few times now, they're two different things. Animism is the religion, it's the spiritual understanding, it's the cosmology, it's the more religious organization of the thing. And, even within animism, when you get down to the cultural level, you're going to have very unique and specific cosmologies, deities, ordering of spirits in the spirit realm, maybe different worlds in the spirit realm, different layers. You're going to have all kinds of nuances, which are going to vary culture by culture by culture. But when you strip all that down, you take away all the cosmologies, all the specific deities and all of that, what you're going to find is animism. And then within animism, what you're going to find is whole entire groups of people that hold to this spiritual tradition, this spiritual belief. And then within that, you're going to find the specific role of shamanism. So I hope that makes sense, the distinction that I'm making between animism and shamanism, and how shamanism itself is not animism. It's tied to it. It can't be separated from it, in my personal opinion. But they're two different things. They're not the same thing. Because not every animistic individual is a shaman. Why it's important to me to make this distinction is because we're experiencing this resurgence of this archaic impulse. And the archaic impulse is that impulse that leads us to want to go back to simpler times, to go back to communal living, to go back to being in harmony with the land, where we're living in a sustainable way, and we're respecting nature, and we're respecting our resources, and we're living quite minimally, and we're seeing all aspects of our planetary resources, our four-legged brothers and sisters, our winged brothers and sisters, equally with the other humans in our lives. And so there's much more of an egalitarian, sort of harmonious way of living. A lot of people are feeling that impulse. That in itself is not fundamentally the shamanic impulse, though. The shamanic impulse is an entirely different thing that has to do with healing. It has to do with bridging between the spiritual and the material worlds, and this type of thing. So they're two different impulses, and they get confused a lot. A lot of people are experiencing this archaic impulse, and they're experiencing it as shamanic because shamans came out of these cultures of archaic animism. Does that make sense? But to me, it's so important to really make these distinctions so that people understand what they're talking about, and who they're talking to, and what path they're actually on, or think that they might be on, or what impulse they're feeling or think they might actually be feeling, or what they're resonating with, or what they think they might be resonating with. Because they're different things. They really are. It's much easier in a sense to be animist than it is to be shaman. Not saying it's easy to be an animist in our rational material culture, because it's not. But being a shaman is just a very specific thing. And I've said this 100 times. It's not an elevated role. It's not something, to be haughty about, or, overly proud or arrogant about, or to think that, a shaman's elevated above anybody else, because in true animistic communal societies, shamans are equal. Everybody's equal. There's no hierarchy in that general sense of it. But it's also important to understand that shamans are called, and that most people really don't want to be shaman, because it's a difficult life. It's a super long, hard initiation process. It's full of a lot of suffering. It potentially leads to death, literal death, possibly, ego death for sure, absolutely. And it's hard. It's a very hard road. It's just not something that most indigenous people wished on anybody else. Most people, they didn't, when their child was chosen as the next shaman to start apprenticing with the shaman, it wasn't a joyous time. Families, moms and dads didn't feel necessarily good about that. They didn't want that. It was resisted. It was seen, as a difficult life of service, a burden in a lot of ways. So that's another interesting thing about our culture that's really, sort of twisted what shamanism is and what it's about. But I mostly just wanted to make the video to make this distinction between animism and shamanism, and to point out that really shamanism is not a religion. It's just such a common thing. I get it all the time, though. As soon as I say I'm a shaman, people will automatically assume I'm talking about Native American spirituality, which is animism. And then they want to know, like, if I studied with any kind of specific tribe, if I have any kind of specific Native American tribal influence, or that type of thing. And they'll immediately want to know, do you do sweat lodges, or, what type of, inipi ceremonies, what type of, lineage and what type of ceremony do you do? And I really try to stay away from all of that, because, the Native American cultures are complex. They're varied, very different. There goes my light flashing again. But they're very complex and they're multi-layered in terms of the roles of people in the community. So they didn't have traditional shamans in the essence that we see them in Mongolia or Buryat, or those Tibetan type shamans, where that word really came from, Siberia, right? They don't have that expression of shamanism. They have holy men. They have herbalists. They have men that could do specific healing ceremonies. Men who held and carried specific visions and things like that. So even within Native American culture, there's a diversity of what we would call shaman, and they don't call shaman. And those people, those men and women, those healers, what we call medicine men or medicine women, generically, they didn't necessarily have that super defined role of shaman where the person was bridging, intentionally, between the spirit world and the material world to do work for people in particular. Mostly what the Native American healers did was pray. They prayed to God, and they did this ceremonially. Some of them had visions. Some of them did enter the spirit world. So I'm not saying it doesn't exist at all. What I'm saying is their definition of medicine man and medicine women, we equate that with shamanism, but in actuality, it is slightly different. And even within this context of medicine men and medicine women, there's this whole range of what the expression of that, somebody's specialty and what they're actually really doing, whether it's holding specific ceremony, whether it's being that holy man and being able to pray, whether it's being that healer and being able to hold specific ceremonies and see the direct results of healing, all these kind of things. They're just different expressions. And interestingly, the Native Americans had a lot of times different words for each sort of thing that a person within the community could be. Different ways of healing. Heyoka, that's another one that was really considered a healer and a sacred role within the community. In a lot of ways, that's very shamanic as well. It's that trickster energy. It's a facet of shamanism. But see, that's the thing. It's just a facet. It's not the whole ball of wax. It's just one facet of shamanism. And so it's interesting. Native American cultures are interesting in that way, because the way that shamanic archetype has been expressed in Native American cultures has been very multifaceted in different individuals. You don't see all the facets, or even 5 or 6 of the facets, very rarely in one individual. So it's almost like you had certain types of shamans, certain specialty of shamans, within the community. And it wasn't, cohesive, if that makes sense. Hopefully what I'm saying is making sense. But yeah, so a lot of people will equate in North America shamanism immediately with Native American spirituality. And again, they're just confusing animism, because the Native American people were and still are very animistic in their belief systems. Their Native American spirituality is a very earth-based spirituality. They do see one God as the creator of all, right? The one, which they have specific names and words for. But within that, there's the essence of that holiness that's all around, that they find in particular things more sacred than others, but all things sacred equally, if that makes sense. So they, the Native Americans have their own sort of spiritual system and traditions and beliefs and knowings, understandings, and direct experiences. And a lot of people, I think, when they feel that archaic impulse, that's really what they're feeling. They're feeling that call to go back to a simpler way of life, that more communal way of life. But again, I just want to make the distinction, that's not the same thing as the shamanic impulse, and they're closely related, but they're different. They're very different. And so to sum this up, I would say no, shamanism absolutely is not a religion. It's completely and totally a practice. And unless you're actually engaged in a very specifically defined practice, a disciplined practice, where you're intentionally doing a certain specific type of work and bridging with full intention, having an ally team of spirit helpers that are helping you do this work in the spirit realm, protectors, and then you're doing this work in the middle world, where all that stuff's happening and people are suffering, all the things that they're suffering. Unless you're, really specifically doing that work on behalf of individuals and a community, then I would say, no, it's not shamanism. It may be animism. It may be a earth-based spirituality. It may be a healing modality of some type, but it's not shamanism. So, I'm just feeling the need to put that out there. As always, if you guys have questions or comments, you can leave them below on the video, or you can get a hold of me through email or on my Facebook page. I love you guys so much, and I hope that you're having a really, really great day.